Hey guys, I'm Tom the Tech Chap, and this is the new iQOO 12, and it is one of the first phones to ship with one of these, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. Now you may remember last year I made this video with this guy, the iQOO 11, because this was also one of the first phones to come out with the 8 Gen 2. Here we are, a year later. I've got a little bit more grey in my beard, I don't know where that came from, but I want to see just how much faster this new phone with the new chip, which will be powering pretty much all flagship Android phones, including the Xiaomi 14 Pro, which is also launched, OnePlus 12, the Galaxy S24 Ultra, although that may actually have a custom version of the chip. But I want to see what this is capable of, and also if it's faster than my iPhone. Now, you may not have heard of iQOO. It's a sub-brand of Vivo, and it's not particularly well known here in the UK, the US, and Western markets, but they're very good phones, and this one's had a pretty significant upgrade. I mean, just look at it for starters, next to last year's iQOO 11. I think it's a beautiful design. We've got these clean edges, a little bit of that BMW branding going on, and this fascination meets innovation. It weighs just 203 grams, which is very light given its size. The S23 Ultra is 234 grams for comparison, and they share the same 6.78-inch screen size. We also get a smoother 144Hz refresh rate, although only in games that do actually support it, otherwise day-to-day it's still 120Hz, plus a peak brightness of a ludicrous 3000 nits. Triple camera on the back, now with bigger sensors and high resolutions versus last year's phone, including a much improved 3x periscope lens. All inside this sort of square-cooled camera module. So in terms of the specs, on the inside we have a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, obviously, and in this particular top spec model it also comes with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 storage. And keeping the lights on is a 5000 mAh battery, which is the same size as this one from last year. However, they say it's the first, an industry first, graphite designed battery, so we'll have to see how that performs in comparison, and also if the efficiency of the new chip goes some way to increasing the battery life as well. Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, and all the trimmings. This is a proper 2024 flagship phone, and also with some nice gaming extras. If I swipe in from the side here to bring up the game menu, some games, like Call of Duty here, offer dedicated esports modes, turning off background notifications and focusing on the game. You can switch between battery saving, balanced, and a monster performance presets. And in some games, there's even a super resolution option that can make the game look sharper without affecting your frame rate. What I definitely recommend though is if you are going to do some proper gaming with this, or indeed any phone, get yourself one of these. It doesn't have to be this, it's the backbone sort of PlayStation USB-C controller, but any controller that adds a D-pad and some shoulder buttons, because unlike the ROG gaming phone, for example, which we're expecting a new version of very soon as well, this doesn't have any shoulder triggers, but a controller like this makes all the difference to playing games on mobile. But still, even if you're not necessarily going to buy this exact phone, it should be a good indicator, given its flagship specs, of how well this new chip performs and how it competes with last year and also the iPhone. So let's get down to business, and if I bring in last year's iQOO 11 for comparison with the 8 Gen 2 and also with 16 gigs of RAM, in Geekbench 6 single core, we're looking at just a 12% uptick, although a more significant 23% boost in multi-core. Still, nothing too crazy, although if we go over to the OpenCL graphics test, it's a whopping 60% gain over last year. And that sort of tallies with the overall 30% gain I'm seeing in Antutu, which tests both the processor and the graphics, although the iQOO 12 actually ran hotter and used more battery during this test. But then, jumping over to the 20-minute 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme Stress Test, we're looking at a 38% bump for both the peak and the low scores, with nigh on identical stability scores. And actually here, in contrast to the Antutu test, the new phone used just 5% of its battery versus 9% on the old model, so perhaps we are seeing some efficiency gains, although it did hit a 5-degree higher peak temperature, and that's despite some improved cooling with this new phone. But how does all that translate to some actual real games? Well, I fired up a bit of War Thunder, maxed out all the settings, and both phones do support ray tracing, and with RT, we're looking at about 80 to 100 FPS with the 8 Gen 2 on last year's phone, versus 100 to 120 on the 8 Gen 3 in the new iQOO 12. Although, if we turn off ray tracing, we get a 10 to 15 FPS boost on both phones, with both hitting 120, although the new 8 Gen 3 iQOO 12 offering consistently higher frame rates. Is it enough to notice? Well, not really, and the biggest difference is only if you have ray tracing on, which doesn't really make much difference in War Thunder, but I guess it does make it more future-proof. But then a quick test of video editing, and exporting this 1-minute 4K 60 video in Premiere Rush, the new phone is consistently about 10% ahead, and then finishing 7 seconds faster. So yes, the new phone is faster, but it's not something you'd necessarily notice. It's not all that significant. We're looking at sort of 10 to 30% across the board, depending on the app. But then most of us aren't upgrading from last year's phone. If you've got a phone from 2, 3, 4 years ago, then yes, this is definitely going to be worth the upgrade and noticeably faster, particularly in gaming. But is it faster than the iPhone 15 Pro Max with the A17 Pro chip? Well, here is one I made earlier, and the answer is kind of. It depends. In Geekbench 6, the iPhone is 28% faster in single core, although just 4% faster in multi-core, but still, in terms of the processor, a win for the iPhone. However, in AnTuTu, I'm getting about 146,000 on the iPhone versus 209,000 on the iQOO, although it does seem to be mostly driven by the graphics score. And then again, firing up 3D Mark, which primarily tests the graphics, we're looking at a similar 42% higher score on the iQOO, which is kind of crazy, although the iPhone does have a higher stability score. So a clear win for this guy? Well, it's not quite as simple as that. If we go back to Geekbench 6 and run the graphics test, the iPhone comfortably beats both the OpenCL and the Vulkan scores of the iQOO when running Apple's Metal API. Different tests, yes, but it shows how apps and games optimized and built using Apple's Metal API can utilize the full power of their Apple silicon. There's a lot of iOS and Android hardware and software differences going on here. Although the iQOO does beat the iPhone in War Thunder, again maxed out both with ray tracing, the iPhone doesn't actually perform that well, jumping between 70 and 105 FPS, and oddly enough, turning off ray tracing doesn't have a significant impact on the iPhone's performance. But if we then jump over to Honkai Star Rail, one of the most graphically demanding games out there and very similar to Genshin Impact, both phones run this flawlessly, with the iQOO easily maxing out the 60 FPS cap. However, the iPhone has an exclusive 120 FPS mode in the graphics settings, unlocking that performance of the A17 Pro and giving us a noticeably smoother gaming experience. Hopefully we see this added to the Android version at some point. The problem I have, though, is as fast as these new chips are, and we see these nice little upgrades each year, there's rarely anything significantly different in terms of features or apps that come out alongside it. I think what is different this year with the iPhone in particular is the ability to run some of these console-level games, as we kind of call them. I mean, they're basically PS4-level assets. They run at sort of 720p, medium settings, but Resident Evil Village, Resident Evil 4 soon, Assassin's Creed, just a handful. But it is good to see the power of these things actually utilized for something, not just slightly higher frame rates in the same old mobile games like Real Racing 3 and Asphalt 9 and Call of Duty that we've been playing for years. But then, of course, there is a future-proofing element to it. You'll be able to flawlessly run any game for the next few years. We may start to see some of these console games come to the Play Store on Android as well, especially if developers are putting the time into porting it over to iPhone. We'll see. And yes, it is able to run ray tracing much faster, so it can, play RT-enabled games at a higher frame rate, but there's barely any out there, and so far I'm not really that convinced by the difference it makes. One last thing before I wrap up though, I just want to show you a few camera samples taken on both the iQOO 12 and the iPhone 15 Pro Max to give you an idea of how they compare, because while there are far too many differences and variables for a direct comparison, especially as iQOO doesn't necessarily claim to offer the best camera system, but of course the new chips, the SoCs, also include ISPs, or image signal processors, which do have a big impact on the processing of your photos and videos and also the camera's features. And I am excited to see how the cameras stack up in all the new flagship Androids like OnePlus 12, Xiaomi 14 Pro, the Samsung S24 Ultra. But just with these handful of side-by-side shots, which do you prefer? Let me know in the comments. So is this little guy actually worth getting excited about? Well, kind of. I mean, the 8 Gen 3 is comfortably faster than the 8 Gen 2, as I say, between sort of 10 and 30% depending on the game, and primarily for the graphics. It does still get pretty warm though. After about 10 minutes of playing Star Rail, it made my hands a little bit sweaty, so we're not seeing any sort of night and day difference in terms of running cooler or efficiency. After all my tests, I did only see a 2 to 3 percentage point battery gain, and AnTuTu actually used more battery, so I'm not really seeing that significant reduction in power use that Snapdragon were claiming. And that marginally improved battery may be just down to the battery design that iQOO made. In terms of how it stacks up with the iPhone, well, I'm going to call it a tie. They're sort of a bit different. In terms of processing performance, in benchmarks, the iPhone wins. In terms of OpenCL and general graphics performance, the iQOO with the 8 Gen 3 wins. But then in the apps and games, which of course are optimized for the Metal API, the iPhone can win. So it's not a straight comparison. It's like comparing a MacBook Pro to a Windows laptop. But importantly, you're not going to be disappointed with either of them. Yes, this has access to a couple of console games, but we're yet to really see that materialize. They both support ray tracing, and while this has a 120 FPS mode in Honkai, this performs better in War Thunder, and there are more gaming features. And to be fair, I've also barely mentioned AI, and that is a big push this year with the new chips and the NPU performance, but we're just not really seeing anything, at least on this phone, that can demonstrate that. There are rumors that we're going to see something called Samsung AI, which is sort of codenamed Samsung Gauss, which could be a pretty impressive on-device AI assistant, like a soup-top Bixby with the S24 Ultra, so we'll have to wait and see. I am also excited to see how this compares with the Dimensity 9300 chip from MediaTek, which will be coming in the Vivo X100 Pro, and also the rest of the 8 Gen 3 phones coming soon from OnePlus, Xiaomi, Samsung, and everyone else. But what do you make of the iQOO 12 and also the performance of what we've seen so far of the 8 Gen 3? Are you tempted to upgrade? And actually, if you are going to get a new phone soon, what do you have your eye on? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, a like and subscribe would be fantastic. I was going to say fascinating, but that's not the right word. Fantastic, and I'll see you next time right here on the Tech Chat.